Garp is a person that believes in the good in people. He doesn't let titles decide his own morality. He took in the child of the Pirate King and had his own grandson looked after by mountain bandits. His own son leads the Revolutionary Army, and he has been noted to despise the Celestial Dragons himself. Yet for his entire career, Garp has remained loyal to the world government as a Vice Admiral of the Marines. And even when Ace was set to be executed, he just sat and silently watched. All of these things combined just don't make that much sense together. So today we're going to be diving into Monkey D. Garp's story to figure out his motivations, talk about some theories surrounding his involvement in Sword and how in the alternate universe, Ace could have been saved. As always, if you like content like this, make sure you subscribe and join our King Pirates crew. And if you have a good time watching this video, please drop a like for the YouTube algorithm. Alright, so let's talk about the story of Monkey D. Garp, and the first thing we have to establish is where he was born. Because Garp, just like Luffy and Dragon, was born in the Goa Kingdom, and this is actually quite notable. And that's because the structure of the Goa Kingdom, politically and even physically, is a perfect representation of inequality within the One Piece world. Politically and economically, the richer people and the nobles are treated much better with higher status, to the point where the kingdom has physical separation separating people by class. In the center, at the highest point, you have the Royal Kingdom, then it descends into Hightown, then into Edgetown, and then outside of the kingdom you have the Great Terminal, where all the trash is dumped. So if you were looking for a kingdom that was a perfect representation of class separatism and inequality, it doesn't get more direct and clear than the Goa Kingdom. So because of that, anybody that is born and grew up in the Goa Kingdom is probably at least aware of the effects of inequality. Even someone like Luffy, for example, saw firsthand how the Great Terminal was burnt down, all to impress a noble. He also saw how differently Sabo was treated because he was born as a noble. And another person that seemed pretty affected by the Goa Kingdom is Monkey D. Dragon. When he came back to the Goa Kingdom and saved Sabo, he referred to the Great Terminal as a blueprint for the world's future. So throughout the story, we've gotten many examples of people born in the Goa Kingdom understanding the effects of inequality. So with the Goa Kingdom also being Garp's birthplace, you have to imagine that it at least has some sort of effect on him. That being said though, we don't really have much more additional information besides the fact that he was born there, and the next bit of information that we know is that he ended up joining the Marines at age 22. Immediately a year after that though, at age 23, was when he had his son Dragon. Now this is a part that actually slightly interests me because maybe it doesn't actually have any significance, but the fact that it came so close to each other just within a year, it feels like Oda might have done that on purpose and it might actually be important. Like for example, if it holds true that Garp and Dragon are somehow working together, this could be significant as well. So just something to keep in mind when we talk about the theories later. Continuing on with the story of Garp though, as a Marine he rapidly climbed the ranks, eventually to a Vice Admiral, but nothing really notable happens in his career until 18 years later at the God Valley incident. This is of course the famous incident where Garp gained the title of the Hero of the Marines by defeating the Rocks Pirates alongside Goldie Roger, but of course the important thing to note here is that he was actually ashamed of his actions because he was forced to protect the Celestial Dragons. And we also know at this point it was confirmed that Garp never took an admiral position because he never wanted to directly serve under the Celestial Dragons. Now we're going to talk about this incident a lot more when we talk about the theories, but one thing I do want to point out is that this incident happened 38 years ago, which means for at least 38 years Garp has resented the Celestial Dragons and never became an admiral just so he doesn't have to serve under them. That's a pretty long time to be working under a branch of a group that you supposedly hate. But that's exactly what Garp did. He continued to serve as a Marine, having his legendary battles with Goldie Roger and Shiki. Eventually he takes in Roger's son Ace and also his own grandson Luffy, and while he does leave them in the care of mountain bandits so he could go back serving as a Marine, it is important to note that he really wanted them to become Marines and even train them for that purpose. Following that though, Garp's story catches up to the present story and we've seen everything that's happened in real time. There are of course a few notable things that we should point out, number one being that he took in Kobe and Helmeppo, which on the surface level seemed just like Garp being a nice guy and taking in two stragglers. But as we know now, Kobe and Helmeppo are rapidly climbing through the ranks, and Kobe is also a confirmed member of Sword. Another important thing to note I think is when he encountered Luffy after Enies lobby. This was really the first time we got to see Garp interact and what type of person he was, and we found out despite him being a hero of the Marines and a Vice Admiral, he was very carefree about carrying out his duties. At the time his actions felt like it made sense because Luffy was his grandson and he wasn't going to take in his grandson, but if we take a look at the situation, Luffy has just broken into Enies lobby, burned the world government flag declaring war on them, and yet Garp just straight up let them go. It isn't until the Straw Hats pretty much have gotten away already that he starts kind of pretending to go after them. So Garp at that point of his career seemed like he was really just doing his own thing, and because of his status, nobody really could overpower him. And even as Luffy continued to do crazy things like breaking into Impel Down, Garp still had this carefree carefree attitude, laughing it off. And it wasn't really until Marineford where his attitude kind of changed and it got really serious. This time around, Ace was actually captured and set to be executed, and a massive war was coming against the Yonko crew. So he was put in a serious conflicting situation where he really had to choose his actions carefully. It was a situation where he had to choose between his family or his loyalty to the Marines. Unlike the Luffy situation, he couldn't help his family without going against the Marines. And in the end, although Garp did not actively help the Marines, he did stay loyal to them. And this is where things get really interesting because his actions at Marineford just feel so conflicted. For most of the war, he just feels completely frozen, undecided on what he should actually do. He doesn't really say much throughout the entire war, but there is one line of dialogue where he shows a lot of emotions. And that is when he sits next to Ace and decides that he is staying loyal to the Marines by not taking any action to save Ace. And when you see his face, you can really see the sadness and regret that he's feeling. But the specific line of dialogue that he says to Ace at that moment is, "Why couldn't you and Luffy just become Marines like I told you to?" Incredibly interesting that that was the line of dialogue that Oda chose to give Garp in that moment. But to wrap things up with Garp's story, after Marineford, he pretty much retires alongside Sengoku. And that is pretty much all we have with the story of Garp so far, one that feels incredibly conflicted with some massive voids missing. So with that said, let's talk about some theories to try to figure out Garp's plans and what really drives his motivations. And the first option I think we should take seriously is that maybe it's not that deep and everything is just as it seems on the surface level. It's possible there's no crazy connections or theories and Garp is just a very straightforward guy that wanted to serve the Marines. Maybe him growing up in the Goa Kingdom didn't impact him in the same way as Luffy or Dragon, or perhaps the inequalities did impact him and instead he chose a different route to protect people. At the same time though, that still doesn't quite explain the conflicting motivations that Garp has, because on one hand he is incredibly loyal to the Marines where he's willing to stand by and watch Ace die, but on the other hand he still hates the Celestial Dragons and doesn't strictly follow the rules of the Marines. So I think the question we really have to answer here is what makes Garp so loyal to the Marines? So going back to that first option where Garp just wanted to become a Marine to protect, there needs to be a strong factor for him not only to want to become a Marine but also to stay so loyal to them. And there's definitely a number of unknown possibilities that could have caused that. Maybe some tragedy happened to him and he just has this strong driving force for him to protect people, or maybe he was saved by a Marine and just feels a lot of loyalty to the Marines because of that, in a way kind of similar to how Shanks inspired Luffy. So maybe Garp joins for one of those reasons and then eventually realizes how corrupt the world government is, but in the end he still decides to stay loyal to them because he still strongly has this motivation to protect people. And overall I think that scenario is entirely possible, but at the same time the introduction of Sword is where things get a little more interesting, specifically because out of the two known members of Sword so far, Kobe is one of them, a person that was personally handpicked and trained by Garp. Which, speaking of Kobe, his reasoning for joining the Marines is very similar to the one I just described about Garp. Before Kobe even joined the Marines, he saw firsthand how corrupted the Marines were with Captain Morgan, but despite that he still wanted to become a Marine to completely change the Marines from within. So could it be possible that Kobe working alongside Garp with Sword is trying to accomplish exactly that? And this is where we get to the theory of Garp leading Sword, which is not a new theory. I've talked about this theory a couple times on my channel. It's also not a theory that I came up with. I first saw it from Randy Troy. I'll link him in the description. But essentially the idea here is pretty simple in that Garp created Sword as a way to go against the world government within the Marines. Overall, I think this theory makes a lot of sense, first off with Garp's character and how he hates the Celestial Dragons, so this could be his way of making change. As I mentioned earlier, the Kobe connection is there as well with him being part of Sword. You also have the fact that CP0 is known as the shield of the world government, so Sword could be going against that shield. At the same time, I do want to point out that it could be argued that Sword and shield are both just weapons of the world government. Besides that though, if this theory is true, it just fills in a lot of the holes that we have about Garp's characters and his motivations and his conflicts, and it also makes a lot of the things that we've seen so far in the story very different. First off, the conflicts that he faced at Marineford just have a lot more weight to them, because now he's not fighting conflicting emotions of protecting his family or protecting the people, but instead is whether or not to save Ace or continuing his mission undercover as Sword. The line of dialogue that Garp says to Ace will make a lot more sense as well, because if he is the leader of Sword, his plan could have been to get Luffy and Ace into the Marines so they could also work in Sword. Now some people might say here, why not just tell Luffy and Ace about Sword in the first place? But at the same time, Luffy and Ace were just kids. Garp wasn't really around all that much, so I don't think it would have been reasonable to sit these kids down and tell them about this top secret operation. Instead, his plan was probably to get them into the Marines and slowly work them into the fold. So if that really was Garp's plan all along, Luffy and Ace could have been in the same position as X-Drake and Kobe. And of course, in that scenario, everything goes along to Garp's plan and Ace Ace would have survived, which puts a lot more weight to the words that Garp said to Ace and the regret that he's feeling. At the same time though, I'm not sure that plan would have led to a happy ending, but I'll talk about that in the next section. Because another thing that's really interesting that ties into this theory is Dragon's role. Because Dragon, just like Garp, is very unknown, so there's a number of different ways it could go. As I mentioned earlier, Dragon was born just a year after Garp joined the Marines, so if you really want to make Garp out to be this grand schemer, maybe he joined the Marines with the goal of creating Sword, to the point where he had Dragon just a year later so he could have someone else lead the Revolutionary Army so they could have this two-sided attack. Now this one I will say is a little far-fetched because that seems like a very detailed plan that I'm not sure Garp could come up with, and also for him to come up with that sort of plan, he would really need to know the interworkings of the world government and everything like that. So I think a much more likely option is that Garp just joined the Marines to protect people and eventually saw the injustice and decided to create Sword. And then as far as Dragon goes, he could have either just decided to create the Revolutionary Army as another way to attack, or maybe he was supposed to be a Marine as well and join Sword, but he just decided to go his own route. What's also quite interesting is the timing of the creation of the Revolutionary Army, which Oda didn't give us a specific time for, but he said it was between 24 and 19 years ago, which pretty much puts it between Roger's execution and the birth of Luffy. And I think the important thing to note here is that the Revolutionary Army was created after Roger started the Great Era of Pirates. So in a way, everything kind of lines up with this new generation. We're seeing that Sword members so far are of this new generation. Dragon created the Revolutionary Army at the start of the Great Pirate Age as well. Now obviously story-wise, Oda is doing this so everything lines up with the ancient weapons and Joy Boy, but looking at the motivations individually, you have to wonder whether or not Garp and Dragon based their actions off of Roger, either realizing that the tide was going to turn because of Roger's actions and knowing that it's the perfect time to go, or maybe Garp and Dragon found out some of the secrets of this prophecy themselves. I don't think that would be shocking to find out given that Garp was at God Valley and was kind of close to Roger in a sense, and Dragon on the other hand, although we don't know much about him, he does lead the Revolutionary Army, so I'm sure he has a lot of information. Now beyond that, there's also a bunch of theories about Garp's wife and Luffy's mom being a celestial dragon, but from what I've seen so far, none of it really has that much concrete evidence, so I'm not really going to discuss those in this video, but if you really have some strong feelings about it, let me know in the comments. Overall though, out of all of these theories, the one I lean towards the most is Garp joining the Marines to protect people, but eventually realizing the injustice that the world government was carrying out and creating Sword to go against that. And if that turns out to be true, it's pretty fun to imagine what would have happened if everything went Garp's way. In this scenario, of course, Ace would still be alive and him and Luffy end up joining the Marines, but while this does end up saving Ace, I can't imagine Ace and Luffy adapting that well. First off, as far as Ace goes, I think in the end he still would end up unhappy, because with Ace, one of the things he struggled with the most is whether or not he deserved to be born, and while he would still have Luffy as a brother and as a family member, it was really Whitebeard and the Whitebeard pirates that gave him the sense of belonging. If instead he ended up joining the Marines, he never would have found that and probably would have hated it more, because he would have heard more about how bad of a person Roger was and how much he didn't deserve to be born. And on top of that, with him being Roger's son and Luffy being Dragon's son, I'm not sure they would have gotten by and been allowed to be Marines. Obviously, Sengoku knew all of that information as the fleet admiral, and while he might have let it slide a little bit, if Luffy and Ace started to climb the ranks, he probably would have put a stop to it. So the progression of Luffy and Ace would honestly not go that smoothly. Like, I think in the ideal world here, Ace and Luffy join the Marines and they're happy and they're still the absolute monsters that they are, but that really just wouldn't be true, because first off, both of them will be weaker because they don't go through the trials and tribulations they do as pirates, and second of all, that final war against the world government probably ends up failing. I think in the current story, that final war will succeed because of Luffy's gift of making a bunch of allies, and he's only been able to do that because he's been freely traveling and exploring as a pirate. As a Marine, on the other hand, obviously he wouldn't be able to do that, so there'd be much less allies in that final war. So honestly, in this scenario, although it might have saved Ace at Marineford, it probably would have led to everyone's demise in the end. As always, thank you guys for watching. Get yourself some One Piece manga with the link in the description. And in my hand, I have a bounty poster of either Buggy, Boa, or Sabo. If you guess it wrong, you have to like, subscribe, and watch the next video. And the answer is Ace 2.0.